closed environment, buildings specifically. So open spaces, as you know, are only just a part of each city. But most of our days, actually, yeah, I can, of course, depends what kind of job we have, but most of our days, usually we are actually spending in different buildings, like restaurants, offices, shopping centers, cinemas, libraries, and of course, our houses. So every building is composed of different kinds of rooms. And the blind person and visually impaired persons have to be able to navigate not only in open spaces, but they have to be able as well navigate to those buildings and in those buildings. We start with the approach to the buildings, because as we talked about a bit earlier, that's the topic of today. So accessible destinations like restaurants, shopping centers, working spaces, etc., our houses, all the buildings. It doesn't really matter if people, yeah, it doesn't matter if they are accessible, if people can't really approach them, can't really get to them. So accessibility of each building starts actually a bit away from them. Simply because, yeah, people have to be able to arrive to them and approach them. So there are few things that you should really think about when it comes to the area around the building. Yeah, so the focus might be on parking, for example, and what to think when it comes to parking and the perspective of the blind and visually impaired people. So the blind and visually impaired, as of today, cannot yet drive cars. We will see how it will in the future when we have automatically driven cars, but as of today, it's not really possible. However, it is still necessary that the parking spaces are designed with the with those two groups in mind. And that's simply because, yeah, from the perspective of a blind and visually impaired person, it is especially important that drop-off spaces in the parking lots are accessible. So when they, for example, arrive by taxi, they can easily leave the car without being afraid of that some other car drives by and runs over them. Little bit what you, Andre, were saying about this bus stop, when there is actually no space, safe space for the person to get out. So what it's good to think about tactile surfaces again. Detectable floor surfaces are very useful accessibility design elements, as we were talking already yesterday, because they will alert the visually impaired person to a hazard ahead. It is important that such surfaces are built in so the blind or visually impaired person can easily navigate to the entrance from the nearest bus or train station, for example, or a parking lot from the drop-off space. Yeah, just to remind everyone and those who haven't been with us yesterday, that tactile surfaces is a system of texture ground surfaces so they indicate and can be found with the footpaths. They can be found on footpaths, stairways, stairs, railways, and different other places. And the goal with them is to assist people with visual impairment to navigate. So yeah, another thing that you should think that you should consider when it comes to the surroundings around the building are stairs, edges, and other obstacles. And those are again those things that can prevent a blind person or visually impaired person from getting to the building. But of course, yeah, we have to be reasonable, and yeah, it is not so often that you can just remove the stairs, for example, from outside the building. But what you can do is to remove all the loose objects and make sure that there is a clean approach to the entrance. You can also, and you should, clearly mark the stairs so that the visually impaired person can easier spot them. The surrounding of each building should also be equipped in large readable signs that work also for visually impaired persons. But we will talk a little bit about signs in a moment. So, how does a perfect entrance look like in that case? Well, there are several things you should pay attention to. Here's just a short list of them, and we will go through with the examples in a second. So it is important to think about orientation, signs, color contrast, different doors, and we can have regular ones, automatic ones, or revolving, stairs and handrails, and elevators. So let's go a bit with some examples. So this is an example of an entrance. And now I would like to ask you, please feel free to just jump in, whoever wants. Do you find it good or bad from the perspective of a visual impaired or blind person? Anyone who would like to comment on this picture? No, I guess no volunteers. Okay, so so I can tell you that the good part of this entrance is that there is natural orientation leading up to the entrance. There are handrails, then that's good. There is a ramp, and that's a good thing. And the setup makes it easy with white cane, so the person can easily navigate. It's also quite wide enough, so even a guide dog can have a space and navigate. The bad thing about it, though, is it is hard to understand where the door starts. So a better visual marking could be a good idea here. So the entrance is, if you wonder why there is some delays, yeah, as yesterday, I have my English presentation on the side, so I can follow it easier. So the entrance is important as it is the first thing that meets the visitor, of course. If there is a reception or a similar thing, you should try to make sure that the reception is possible to find without stumbling over different things. So yeah, as again, no clutter, no loose obstacles on the floor anywhere. If the entrance is a big room, it is good to consider having some kind of tactile orientation support leading to the reception. So it's easier for the blind and visually impaired person to find it. And again, it should be with the contrast to the floor, so even people with low vision can see it. Another key element is glass. I guess you for sure know that in many modern buildings, it is common to have transparent materials. They are used, which can be very efficient because it separates different sections of the room. And at the same time, it lets in lighting. Yeah, it allows light to shine through. But glass doors and glass walls can be very difficult to detect for visually impaired persons. So what you can do about that? There are two ways. You should always try to make sure to either block the approach to glass objects, so it's not possible really to run into them, or just to put visual markings on them. Another thing is signs. So signs are important for everyone. In a building that you don't know beforehand, many visitors rely on the sign. I guess we all can relate to that. But for the blind visitors, getting help from the reception is probably the best way to orient themselves. Or if it is possible, to describe the way on beforehand, in information sent out together with an invitation, for example, that may also be helpful. For visually impaired people, on the other hand, it is important that the signs have a good contrast and can be easy to read. The size of the letters can vary. It depends on the situation and the location of the sign. So if you can stand close to it, the content can be smaller, of course. A sign that is made to be read from the distance must naturally be bigger. I don't know, but maybe Pavel will tell you a little bit more in detail about different requirements in Slovakia. Because what I'm talking about is general information about how it is in different countries, but I mean, Pavel can tell you which part of this are actually recommendation or which is the law in Slovakia. So I let it to him. The signs are easier to see if they are made in a contrasting color to the wall. And I will talk about the contrast in a few seconds. When it comes to tactile signage, which is the raised letters and braille, this is only useful in specific places. For example, in the elevator, or to distinguish between toilets, washrooms. It is important for you to remember that not all blind people read braille. It's a common misconception. And at the same time, it is not so feasible to touch everything in hope for a braille sign. So the recommendation is that you make sure to use tactile signage where it makes actually sense. And that's, for example, the good way of figuring this out is if you do some user testing, for example. So you should use braille in signage which identifies rooms or spaces, such as auditoriums, cafeterias, toilets, floor numbers, and both inside and outside of elevator. Contrast. Color contrast is another key component in your toolbox when designing spaces for persons who are visually impaired. And it is often very important to distinguish one object from another in order to be able to orient yourself in a physical space. That's a key thing for the visually impaired person. So we know from the experience that the building can be logically laid out, include proper use of signage, provide good lighting, but still cause disorientation if the color contrasting is too low. So that's why please remember to always include color contrast, which can be used very effectively for many purposes. And for example, to draw attention to signage, to define a route or direction, and can be both natural or by specific guidelines, and to define different areas. Color contrasting items are also a very effective means in defining spaces. So a color contrast of about 70% is generally recommended to clearly define items, like, for example, a dark door frame against a light door and a light wall, a light floor color with a dark perimeter against a light colored wall, handrails that color contrast with the surrounding wall color, and stairs need to have a color contrasted at the start and the ending. And here an example about stairs. So a good example of how visual and tactile marking blends in design, you can see on this picture. It is easy to imagine that stairs always pose a potential danger to the blind and partially sighted persons, and falling accidents are unfortunately quite common. So that's why it is extra important that the stairs are marked and have handrails. So for a blind person, to understand where the stairs start and end, it is good to use tactile marking. But for the partially sighted, it is good to use color marking as well. So like, for example, you see on this picture, these dark dots, they are both tactile and they have good contrast towards the stair. Yeah, and that's a good thing to have on the first and the last step of the stairs. Consistent stair height and width helps everyone, but is especially important for visually impaired and the blind. And the same is true for the handrails. They are important for many people, of course, including blind and visually impaired. And for these target audiences, it is a must both for orientation and balance. So if possible, have handrails on both sides. So this will allow for many users to use actually stairs at the same time. They can move in different directions in parallel. But for users, but also for users with limited mobility, it will allow them to choose the side they actually prefer to walk on. The handrail supports its users most if it continues all the way and ends in a rounded way, or is attached to walls, for example. And here we have another example, but just reverse colors. So here we have a dark floor and light tactile markings. So you can see it can work on both services. And here we have another example of the stairs. This is what very often, this is how it might look like in the hospitals, for example. So you have the marking, the tactile and color contrast marking on every single step. It is not necessary, but it occurs as well, as you can see. And here we have a bad example. So it can even be too much of a good thing. In the sense of really making things available, sometimes you can go over the board and exaggerate. So like in this case, this is a typical example when too many visual elements make it difficult to understand what is actually going on and what the person should look at. And for many users, this might be very difficult to handle actually. So yeah, don't overdo it. Simple message. And here we have an example of contrast between floor, wall, and door, and even a sign there on the wall. So it is actually quite interesting because this is almost always there without even thinking about it. It's quite natural. We like to have a color difference between floors and walls. Not always doors, but I mean definitely walls and floors. And we don't think about it. It doesn't necessarily have to be connected to accessibility. So I don't know, I mean, I can imagine that if you look around in your spaces, wherever you are, in the office or at home, it's quite natural. I mean, I can see at my home, I mean, I have white walls and wooden floors. It's quite natural to have. And imagine a completely white room with no dividing when everything is totally white. I mean, this is almost unpleasant. And it applies basically to majority of the people, despite if someone is visually impaired or not. So that's very interesting thing. I mentioned earlier that there is as well important to think about different doors. And here you can see a regular door, automatic door, and revolving doors. So if we start with the regular ones, if a visually impaired person cannot recognize where the door is, they cannot enter the building or a room for that matter. But the person can also get hurt, especially if the door opens outward. So that's why it is very important that all doors are clearly marked, including a so-called impact space. So I mean, when you open the door, how far it opens, it's good actually to mark it as well on the floor with a contrast color. Additionally, you should make sure that the door opener is placed in the correct place and that the door handles are contrast marked against the door itself. When it comes to automatic doors, any glass parts of the door should be contrast marked. Like on the picture here, we have glass doors with white dots on. And that of course helps the visually impaired person to easily recognize them. And this goes for all doors, of course, but especially for the automatic doors. So it's easy to spot them. When it comes to revolving doors, this can be difficult and scary for some people with visual impairment. So that's why there should always be an alternative, like a regular door. And in this case, they should be clearly marked or informed about, so the visually impaired person can find it easily. Let's talk about the elevators as well, which are part of the entrance and reception of the buildings. So from the perspective of a visually impaired and the blind person, the most important parts of the elevator are the buttons. So make sure that the buttons both outside and inside the elevator are clearly marked visually as well as tactile. There are standard colors and icons for the entry floor, emergency, etc. So it's always good to check what the standard is in your country. And outside and inside of elevators, it is also best practice to use Braille. The visual impaired, the visual information about which floor the elevator has stopped should be large enough to read from the distance. This is especially relevant for specific elevators. And it's always good to have as well audio, of course. So in modern elevators, an automatic voice is used to announce at which floor the elevator is stopping. And these two things, they are not alternatives, but should be used in combination actually. So you both have the large signage that says about the floors and then audio information. That's the best combination. But I think maybe Paweł as well will address that a little bit in more detail. What's valid for Slovakia, especially. And here you can see an example of elevator panel with raised buttons and tactile numbers. There is as well Braille, if you can see, and there are clear color marking on the entrance level which is in green in this case, and emergency calls, that's in yellow.